Black crows speak in Jordmain Wood, Jordmain Wood, Jordmain Wood. Black crows speak in Jordmain Wood, don't dare listen. Plug your ears with black sheep's wool, black sheep's wool, black sheep's wool. Plug your ears with black sheep's wool, don't dare hear them. Black sheep's wool will rot your head, rot your head, rot your head. Black sheep's wool will rot your head, don't dare touch it. Run away to Cannock Chase, Cannock Chase, Cannock Chase. Run away to Cannock Chase, don't dare go there. Black crows talk in Jordmain Wood, Jordmain Wood, Jordmain Wood. Black crows talk in Jordmain Wood, don't dare listen. Jordmain Wood, nursery rhyme. Cannock Chase area, 16th century, author unknown. From The Lost Rhymes, 2011 edition, courtesy of Carver Publishing. Chapter 1. In My Own Words. Where to begin? More difficult than it might seem. Starting is usually the hardest part, don't you think? I never realized how tough it must have been for them, staring at a blank page and racking their little brains for some starting point. Even though their assignment didn't require invention, a simple catalogue of events would have sufficed. It must have been a terribly daunting task, especially when the events in question were unsavoury. Sometimes worse. Far, far worse. I'm already digressing. I fear that will be one of my many failings. Acquiring a voice, when muteness was your original condition, tends to engender a certain garrulous quality. So I'll cease my tangential wandering and get back to the job in hand. Best that I begin at the beginning. That's a good place to start with most stories, and mine is no different. Not in that regard, anyway. History is where we must go. The past. Back then, my existence was a nomadic shuffle, unpredictable and erratic. I was passed from hand to hand. Loving hands, generally, in their own way, although the handling could be rough at times. All part of the deal. It comes with the territory, as they say. That sort of life, it's not always easy. You see some sights. Dear me, you see some sights. The things I've seen. Chapter 2. Snady passes the baton. George, you're an especially lucky boy. It's your turn for Dogum, but as it's the summer holidays, you get to look after him for a whole 6 weeks. Remember to keep his diary, and make sure the whole class hears of his adventures when we all come back in September. Mrs. Snady handed the toy dog to George with due reverence. Dogum was such a great idea. A stuffed toy, a deliciously adorable stuffed toy, by the way, with a duty stapled to his tail. The obligation was a sneaky, invisible attachment, and didn't detract from his appeal. He was too cute for that. Gosh, he was cute. Mrs. Snady could have gobbled him up. He was so lovely. Yes, she could. Except that wasn't the idea. Sadly, munching was out of the question. He was an educational tool. Hug and snuggle him as much as you liked. You could fill your boots on that front, so long as you documented his time in your care, populated his imaginary diary while he was with you. The kids loved him, and he gave the teachers a rare insight. The diaries were pure gold. A little one's writings were precious. Glimpsing an intellect in the early stages of development was a privilege and something to be treasured. But she was a professional and had to rise above the indulgences of awe and wonder. Dogum was a working dog. The parents inevitably had to help at this age, and that provided a unique angle on assessing the child and his home environment. Doggem delivered deeper insights than literacy level or imaginative capacity. If the diary came back blank, you kept a close eye on the child in question. It could be an indication of problems at home. If neither it nor the toy came back, you had a chat with your colleagues and increased the level of vigilance. That had only happened once. Pengu the penguin had gone home with Melissa Stanhope and never returned. Lengthy investigations by a variety of agencies had revealed a catalogue of abuse that had made Mrs. Snady feel ever so slightly sick to her stomach. Pengu had been utilised in ways that went beyond unimaginable, and then burned while the poor girl was made to watch, an act guaranteed in itself to disturb the child. It paled in comparison to the other tortures she'd endured. The despicable Mr. Warped Bastard Stanhope was currently spending time at Her Majesty's pleasure, behind bars where he belonged. As far as June Snady was concerned, castration with a rusty knife would be too good for the man. None of which had any relevance to George. His parents were doing a good job. Georgie Gould was a little star. Chapter 3. In My Own Words. I was fortunate in many ways. Hooper and Yarden was a relatively gentle school in a relatively respectable area. Oak Hill was a decent place, one of those districts that desperately wanted to be middle class and worked hard at sticking to civilized values. That said, these days I wonder more and more about the so-called respectable areas, whether they hide darker hearts than any found in the sinkholes of society, whether the assiduously maintained houses and tidy gardens are merely more effectively managed camouflage, cracked windows and syringe-littered pavements distasteful, yet an ultimately more honest reflection of the residents, some of them at least, an external representation of the turpitude that can hollow out a spot for itself in the human breast. There I go again, wandering off topic. Anyway, my school was a safe enough space. The children were a mixed bunch, but I suppose that's the case with most things. You needed to be made of the right stuff, durable fabric and sturdily stitched seams. Some of the little ragamuffins seemed intent on ripping you to bits. Thankfully, they were a minority. Somewhat alarming when encountered, but hardly the norm. Sometimes there was no interest at all. Those spells could be boring, particularly if you were slung in a cupboard and abandoned to the gloom. On occasion they could be blissful, an opportunity to simply soak up the atmosphere and learn more of the world. There is never any end to that, the desire for learning. I'm blessed with a boundless curiosity. Or is it a curse, the thirst for knowledge? Who knows? You only find out at the end, when your race is run. Migration is a curse, of that I'm sure. Squeeze and smother was routine, a bearable feature of the landscape. Whatever the situation, it was usually okay. Wearing, all the same, mind and body, a parade of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The sense of powerlessness as life unspools before you. Chapter 4. Dogum meets the parents. George's face was a picture of troubled pleasure as he made his way outside to meet his mother. Being entrusted with Dogum for the holidays was a singular honour, but a hell of a responsibility for a 5-year-old. He wasn't sure he could record everything that would happen over the holidays. It was a very long time, a seemingly endless amount of time. His writing wasn't that great. Some of those letters were tough. It'd be okay. Mum or Dad would lend a hand. Both were good with words. As it was, they hardly paid any attention to his explanation about Dogum or the accompanying letter. Smiled and nodded with unlistening distraction, a common enough grown-up attitude when preoccupied. They seemed tense. George didn't need to hear or understand everything they were saying to feel the chill in the air. Adults had a capability that verged on magic. They could lower the temperature of a room with a raised eyebrow or the tilt of a head. "It's all arranged. The last 2 weeks in August at the cottage in Georgemain Wood. My mother will already be there. She spends a lot of the summer at the cottage." There was a certain sharpness to Kath Gould's features that meant her face eluded true beauty. As if God had taken his eye off the ball at the last minute and allowed something snappish to creep into the mix. She was a strikingly attractive woman none the less, never more so than when she was charming her way through a difficult subject. "Kath, I'm really not sure, you know." Tom Gould glanced at George and lowered his voice. "Maybe it's not such a brilliant idea, what we discussed. Maybe we ought to just holiday abroad this year, somewhere cheap, on our own." The movement of his mother's hair as she cocked her head was hypnotic, obsidian curling into a moonless night. "Tom, you suggested it, right at the beginning, remember? Yes, she's getting on, seen a lot of life, old and as healthy as a butcher's dog, but she doesn't do much nowadays other than pore over those silly old books. We can't keep putting it off. She could drop off her perch tomorrow, or maybe she'll live for another 30 years. Who can say? We need to be realistic." A shadow fell across his father's face, lingered before leaving, like it was considering permanent residence. George wasn't sure he wanted to put any of it in Dogum's diary. Chapter 5. In my own words. Sentience? I'm just a throwaway toy, an inanimate object. How can I have thought and emotion, opinion and experience? I'd shrug my shoulders if I could. The world is brimful of mystery. There's no denying that, and you're a fool if you try. There are dark heights and bright depths, and each as mystifying as the other. I ponder it more and more as time passes. Now that I think about it, sentience isn't really the right word. Sapience is the correct term. Le mot juste, as they say. I'm a toy dog that can think and reason, and I do have a certain understanding of how that miraculous state of affairs came into being. I know the who and the where and even the when, but not the precise how, and I doubt I'll ever know that. To seek such knowledge would require courage far greater than whatever is woven into my seams. I may have previously misspoke. Perhaps my curiosity isn't boundless after all. It was George, the who, the where and the when, the moment he gently laid his small hand upon me in that classroom. Some strange and unknowable energy smeared across the universes and settled behind my glassy eyes. I think it was his innocence. That was the enabling force. Some spirit within him, unsullied and undiluted, passed without conscious thought. It conjured life. That was where it started, where I started. This is my first tale to tell. There are many others, but his takes precedence. Our stories diverge more swiftly than I would have liked. At the beginning, they are all but indistinguishable. Chapter 6. The Goulds Pack Bags. It would be 3 weeks before family Gould began their staycation and journeyed to the cottage in Georgemain Wood, a spot of secluded splendour nestled in the corner of Kennet Chase, the latter an expanse of unspoiled wilderness in the heart of the country, a secret in plain view, familiar to surprisingly few, wild and wonderful, as if it had been plucked from some distant country and transported to the new. To know such places intimately was to know that nature was an untamed thing, with rules of a different, more ancient order, law scrawled in the wind, and instruction scattered in the soil. a place simultaneously unforgiving and open to embrace. An odd period for George Gould. Time for a 5-year-old is, after all, an elastic thing, stretching and folding in ways that are forgotten as age dulls wonder and everyday mundane takes the reins. Moments littered with whispered conversation and simmering discord. There was something amiss between his parents. A sensitive boy like George didn't need to grasp details to feel the pressure drop. You didn't need to know the ins and outs of meteorology to see a storm on the horizon. He wasn't overly concerned. Not being at school might get old, but it would take longer than 3 weeks. Despite his tender years, George was enjoying the affinity for freedom common to anything that ever drew breath. He felt liberated. And besides, adults were as unknowable as the clouds, and none of it really made a great deal of difference. Food still needed eating, even the yucky stuff, and games still needed playing, even the challenging ones. He was intrigued by the thought of a holiday and seeing his grandmother. They didn't go away often, and Grandma Joan, his mother's mother, was a vaguely scary figure. Kind, but wreathed in so many wrinkles that you couldn't help being a bit scared. How could a face have so many lines and retain the capacity to smile? How could hair be so raven black and yet streaked with burnished chrome? How could such crooked hands produce such yummy cakes? He hoped it would provide some material for Dogum's diary. Up to now, that was an unopened book. Chapter 7. In My Own Words. George was close to perfect as a custodian. Considerate and caring without exhibiting any need to crush the filth from my seams or chuck me at the wall to see how far I'd bounce. You never know what you've got until it's gone. So they say, and the saying is true. Not many of my keepers after that managed to balance as well. No, my treatment at the hands of George Gould was fine and dandy. That wasn't an issue. I was unmolested, periodically carried from room to room, a fluffy mascot who felt loved, the ornamental, unobserved observer, a hidden camera with a mystically encrypted recording mechanism. It was peaceful, although I don't know how I knew that. How my mind could be newborn and yet fully formed, strewn with archaic phrases and unlearned knowledge. Those mysteries. Ah, those mysteries. The more you unravel, the knottier they become. Of course, the piece was only surface scrim. There was an undercurrent. Snippets of conversation here, snatched glances there, when George wasn't around or out of earshot. They were mindful of him, without him being uppermost in their minds. They loved him in their own way. Despite being fractious and conniving, they loved him. I'm sure of that. Mr. and Mrs. Gould were a sliding conundrum, and the reveal was infuriatingly partial. Kath Gould didn't get on with her mother Joan. That much became apparent during those becalmed weeks. The storm broke in Jordmain Wood, at a cottage on the edge of Kennet Chase. Chapter 8. Grandma Greets the Goulds. Sometimes her husband drove like an old woman. The dirt road leading to the cottage was rough, but there was no need to crawl along like some myopic pensioner walking a push-bike. Maybe in the winter, when it became more muddy swamp than road. Not in summer. The ruts and potholes were half-remembered ghosts of what they'd be once snow and rain set in. She sighed and held her tongue. Tom had spent the last 3 weeks trying to not be here. It wouldn't take much for him to turn tail and run back home. And to be fair, the track was unsettling, even in the sunshine. Shadowed by the trees rearing above and reaching down, she shivered despite the warmth of the day. Kath had never cared for the cottage, nor Jordmain Wood. Never cared for her mother's arcane beliefs and power of nature crap. Old news. Water under the bridge. None of it mattered now. Her mother wanted to see her grandson. That was the only reason they were bumping along the lane. "Are we there yet?" Neither she nor her husband replied. She merely pointed as they rounded the last twist in the track, and the cottage popped into view. Her mother greeted them on the path, gave her daughter and son-in-law a stiff hug, and then bent to her grandson. "And, how is the world treating little Georges?" She pronounced his name the French way, soft and shushed like an exhalation of breath. Good, Grandma." She reached out a long finger and brushed the nose of Doggem. "Who is this fine fellow?" George beamed. Nobody else seemed much bothered about Doggem, and he was a big deal. "He's Dogum, and I have to write his diary. Will you help? Can we do it together?" Joan Demdike winked. "I expect we might." Chapter 9. In My Own Words. Entering Jordmain Wood was akin to entering another world. I know. It's a vague statement within kissing distance of meaningless cliché. You have to appreciate how difficult it is putting into words the atmosphere that saturated our vehicle as the boundary marker receded. How heavy the branches sat against the sun, as if they were tears in the fabric of reality rather than vibrant, growing things. How the wheels seemed to vibrate to a suddenly vacant frequency. Sound dulled, and at the same time wetted with water. How can I adequately explain something that felt both abrupt and subtle? If I haven't said this before, I'll say it now. I don't have all the answers. I wished I did, and I'm glad I don't. Surely the impossible, because that's what I am, should be able to accurately summarize impossibilities. Sadly, the answer is no, not always. Chapter 10. Old Roses Get New Guests. From the outside, Old Roses looked like the top of a spooky chocolate box. A deceptively large building, the scale somehow diminished by its surroundings, as if it had grown from, rather than been constructed within, its environment. Ancient granite faded to the colour of the forest and swathed in greenery. The cottage risen from the ground and clothed by it out of respect. The trees not so much crowding in as reaching out to lovingly caress. The interior was quite a contrast. A long time since Kath had set foot inside these stone walls, the year before she left home. There'd been a complete refit since then, a very tasteful refurbishment, all of the period features retained and carefully integrated with contemporary functionality. It must have cost a fortune. Not that her mother couldn't afford it. The tight old bitch. She was rich. Not just middle-class, comfortable affluence. Proper wealth. Live off the interest with the stack still growing. Kath and Tom didn't get a sniff of it. Leaving home at 16 because she couldn't bear her parents had meant Kath was cut off. Her father had refused to provide financial assistance, and when he passed away, her mother didn't change tack. No surprise. No surprise. Joan Demdike had always worn the metaphorical trousers. It had been her decision in the first place. Kath bit back the resentment. Bitterness was a futile emotion, so why indulge it? Given the opportunity again, she would make exactly the same choices. Now wasn't the time to dwell on the injustices of the past. The years of penny pinching and hand to mouth while her mother was minted, money lying unneeded and untouched in bank accounts while Kath was buying groceries at the cheap shops and picking clothes from the bargain rails. Seeing those around her being helped and supported by parents who had a fraction of the wealth of her own. How could she not be frustrated? The sheer unfairness of it. But done was done, and wouldn't be undone by wishing it were different. The clocks only went one way, even in the twisted Demdike household. Wishing got you precisely nowhere. Action was all that counted. Chapter 11. In my own words. A dance. I'd liken it to a dance. One of those restrained ballroom rituals involving prolonged periods of interaction without physical contact. The participants performing an intricate sequence of move and counter-move accompanied by false smiles. They circled each other, the Goulds and Joan Demdike. Not like they were looking for openings, more a display of wariness. Stepping softly, oddly cautious and overly solicitous, as if they might commit an indiscretion if they got too close, somehow betray themselves. This strained holding pattern a preferable option to an unvoiced alternative. It was a rather difficult dynamic to gauge. You have to remember, although I'd woken into consciousness equipped with an acceptable intellect and a pleasing vocabulary, I was fundamentally inexperienced, not without guile or completely gullible, but certainly a little starry-eyed. Why wouldn't I be? The world was a miracle, and my existence in it more miraculous still. I might somehow have had an old head on my stitched shoulders, but everything was still new, bright and intriguing. Even the everyday tired and tedious has a spangly fascination when seen with fresh eyes. The creeping progress of a shadow as dawn unfolds with implacable composure. The hypnotic seesaw swing of a feather at the mercy of invisible tides. The nimble industry of a spider as it spins a web of hope and hunger. To witness such small things and truly see them is to witness that which defies explanation. The glorious wonder of creation. Once more I'm straying from the subject. I'm a dog, so perhaps straying is in my nature. Unable to exercise my legs, I'm reduced to letting my mind run wild. What I'm alluding to in my meandering fashion is the fact that there were undercurrents within those time-worn walls. Nothing alarming on the surface, sense of unseen movement nonetheless. Calm waters are sometimes the most misleading, and all the more dangerous for it. Don't you think? Chapter 12. Mr. Blue Sky breaks records. That summer wasn't just warm, it was baking, one of the best in recent memory. The air was thick and heavy. Most days, by mid-morning, it felt like you were dragging steam in and out of your lungs. The news channels compared it to the summer of '76. They weren't wrong, it was a sizzler. There was seemingly endless footage of sluggish rivers slowly going dry, and officials sweating through their suits as they warned of water shortages. Numerous shots of folks acting the idiot in fountains. The dubious pleasures of ice creams melting and forest fires flaring into incontrollable. When tinder dry was the order of the day, simple treats became sticky hands, and dropped matches spelled disaster. The downsides of hot weather didn't really register with the Goulds. The adults were wrapped in themselves, their son oblivious to the heat, captivated by his grandmother, Any nervousness about her had fallen away. She was a mesmerizing presence. It could, of course, simply have been that she gave him her undivided attention. Blistering heat coinciding with school holidays should have translated into crowds, but Jordmain Wood remained quiet, nearly empty. The hoi polloi didn't flock to it. Tourists failed to swarm. Kennet Chase did attract more visitors, even then not what you'd expect. A smattering, you could say, and few of them ventured into the cloud of trees that squatted at one edge of the chase, like a dark smudge. George took to carrying Dogum as he wandered the woods. His mother decreed that he was never to go walk about alone. More often than not, his grandmother accompanied him. It was on one of these occasions that he broached a subject that had been troubling him. "Why can't I come into the woods alone, Grandma? Are there baddies?" He was bright as a beautiful button, and twice as charming. Joan Demdike could have eaten him up, right there and then, except that wasn't the idea. Sadly, eating was out of the question. "Do you see that tree, George? The big one just over there?" He followed the gentle curve of her nail. "It's very old. Some would say ancient, and very strong, deeply rooted. It wears the snow as a coat, and drinks sun for nourishment, shrugs and sways with the world, and lives without worry. When it was a sapling, a child, it would have been easy to hurt it. Now, though, now it would take something extraordinary to bring it down. It's grown into its strength." It was suddenly dark and cool under trees. Warmth had whisked away, light become a rumour of dappled ground. Grandma's eyes glittered gold, and the chrome in her hair glowed silver. Both seemed to shimmer and shift with things unknown and unknowable. She lifted her arm and clicked her fingers. Stillness settled, the huge and all-encompassing stillness of the clock stalling, and the world pausing mid-turn. A fragment of eternity broken by muted cracks and the rustling disturbance of leaves. The crow landed on her wrist like plumed vapour, black and bristling, huge and intimidating. It angled its head and stared at him, fluffed itself, and looked again. "Step into the shadows. Step into the shadows." Words whispering in his mind and then gone, like they'd never been there at all. George walked back to the cottage on wobbly legs that could have happily run. Dogum snuggled to his chest, substitute blankie against his skipping heart. One thought in his little head. He wouldn't walk the woods alone any time soon. Chapter 13. In my own words. What happened in the woodlands that day was a revelation. The old woman was wilder than the wind in the trees. She had something older than time in her bones. I was scared to the seams and filled with awe. It was as close as George ever came to crushing me, and to be honest, I needed a bit of crush, some comfort to soften the shock. Normality re-established itself. As I've already said, with hindsight it was a strained conviviality, the way those four humans navigated the weird luxury of the strange cottage. Since then I've witnessed oodles of not right, but rarely anything as unright as that. I've come to know that everyday horror is awful and commonplace. But there is worse, so much worse. Easily included and easy to ignore means I get to see a lot more than the kids. What I'm trying to say is that George wasn't privy to all conversations. Nobody ever is. Chapter 14. Kath and Tom cook up a plan. They stood side by side in the kitchen. Tom flicked a foot at the cat, and it bleared out of sight in the blink of an eye. A blackened blur. Gone in an instant, like it was never there at all. Are we really going to do this? Think about it, Kath. This is some serious shit, and we don't even know if we'll cop for the money anyway. You haven't seen her, what do you call it, last will and testament. God knows what she's going to do with the money when she's gone. She might have left it all to an effing cat's home. Kath Gould, nee Demdike, paused, clunked the pestle into the mortar, turned her head, and gripped his wrist. Do you want to live like this? The crappiest house in the street with the crappiest car on the drive. Both of us slaving away at dead-end jobs for a notch above minimum wage and no prospect of better. Me dealing with the scum of the earth on a day-to-day basis, and you shoving free newspapers through letterboxes to scrape together enough money to meet the mortgage payments. The shadow of what could be looming over us. Her shadow, the evil old cow. Don't you want to wake up in the morning and feel free? Think about it. Designer clothes within reach. Caribbean holidays so close you can smell the ganja. Get real, Tom. If she doesn't leave it to me, she'll leave it to George. He's all she's got now. She worships him. She's madder than my father ever was. She let the nasty bastard do it and chanted in the background. She'd lost the plot before dementia could get a look in. But trust me, Tom, crazy as she is, George will get the money, and it'll work. She taught me this stuff, even though I wasn't interested. I know what I'm doing. Don't wimp out on me now, babe. Tom frowned. Kath could almost hear the wheels turning. When his brow creased like that, he looked one step up from imbecilic. Those furrows often put in an appearance as they sat at the breakfast table, and he was puzzling over the challenges of the day ahead. On more than one occasion she'd considered using them as a toast rack. Not fair. She was being unkind. It wasn't his fault. He was all right between the sheets, but she'd always known he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box. It was one of the reasons she'd married him. Yeah, you're right, Kath. How do we handle it? I mean, like, what do I need to do? She rewarded him with a smile. You don't need to do anything, apart from not eat any of the food I serve her. If you do that, I'll be arranging 2 funerals. Chapter 15. In my own words. Watching them discuss their plan to poison the old woman was an absolutely appalling thing, too traumatic to properly express. An achy chill to the wadding, like your insides were encased in ice and soaked in lighter fuel, waiting for flame. A long way from the ordinary marvels about which I've previously waxed so lyrical, as far removed as you can get. Some sights don't need to be seen. It's as plain as that. And there's the rub. Being alive, and that's what I am despite the lack of heartbeat and distinct absence of circulatory system, is sometimes a rather torrid business. How I wished it were otherwise. Perhaps it can't be. Perhaps that's the deal. An awful balance, which is apparently weighted on the wrong side. The bad, unjust side. But appearances can be deceptive. I'm becoming surer with each passing day that life itself is the great gift. The brilliance of existence tips the scales and leaves them more or less permanently out of whack. Darkness proliferates in a desperate attempt to restore order to the universe. I've witnessed a fair amount of human venality since the dreadful events at Jordmain Wood. I'm glad to say instances of real malevolence have been few and far between. I'm thankful for that. Exposure to a little is informative, and can be washed out. Too much, and you run the risk of being permanently stained. I'm at it again. I intend rubbing my nose in that particular patch of departure from the track in a hopeless attempt at aversion therapy. It wasn't Tom Gould's fault, that's the point. He was a somewhat stupid, rather greedy individual. If he was evil, the evil had entered through osmosis. It wasn't sitting at his core from the start. He was a flawed, vacuous man who fell prey to someone far more purposeful. Skin-to-skin contact with his wife had slowly dripped the devil into his soul. Kath Gould was a toxin. My fake fur is matting at the thought of her, stuffing clumped into hard little balls. A somehow sharp, yet pretty face. Midnight hair that carried night into day, and that's about as close as I can get. There was something truly dark inside her, something small and callous that came from beyond the pale and promised nothing but damage. Chapter 16. Kath lays the table. It was late in the evening when they ate, the sun low in the sky, licking through the trees, ready to kiss the horizon. They were outside, on the crazy paved terrace. Heat, however oppressive, was a passing joy, all too soon gone. You had to make the most of it. George was in bed, exhausted after another day of fresh air. In a sweat-dampened inspiration, a bit of fun, he'd left Dogum on the table to eat with them. "Do you need me to help?" Kath shook her head. The last thing she needed was her mother mixing up the meals. "Okay, I'll get drinks. Rosé for everyone?" Tom nodded and her daughter twitched a smile. Joan Demdike adored chicken and vegetable balti, a fortunate state of affairs for Kath Gould. It was an ideal vehicle. Lashings of heavy sauce, swimming with exotic spices, wouldn't be marred by an additional ingredient, one that was unique to these islands, known only to a select few. It had never appeared on any restaurant menu. If it ever did, the eatery in question would be closed down in short orders. Doors bolted lickety-split, and all sorts of officialdom descending like flies. Her mother gobbled it up like the Last Supper. All the while, the toy dog sat there, stitched cute smile and glassy wise eyes that shone bright in the waning light. Tongue-tied observer to invidious acts and ageless machinations. Meal consumed, they reclined in replete silence, finished the wine and drank in the last rays of sun. Joan Demdike let out an enormous belch, a thunderous gunshot of sound that startled the birds from the trees. "Oh dear, do excuse me. Rich food has a tendency to repeat these days." Her daughter and son-in-law shared a glance laden with meaning and laced with expectation. Chapter 17. Last meals leave nasty tastes. Tom Gould was the first to exhibit symptoms, a hand to the chest and a pained expression. He suddenly stood, knocked over his chair, staggered from the table, gasped for breath and retched, vomit dribbling from blue-tinged lips and a wet stain flowering on his shorts, then crumpled to the ground and vomited again, brown, brackish fluid shot with bright red blood. Despite the subdued thrashing, He was dead minutes after hitting the deck. Kath Gould made no move to help him, simply stared open-mouthed at her mother, listened to a voice shaded with echoes of the horrible childhood crows. "You were a disappointment from the start. A grasping, clueless youngster who became a grasping, clueless grown-up. I shouldn't be surprised by this latest fiasco. You never listened." She stirred the leftovers on her plate. "I can taste the Markham root in this. You haven't disguised the bitterness or prepared it properly. It gave me wind, but that's about it. You need to marinate the root in a distillation of Mewling Widow and Spider's Cap mushrooms. Mix them into the right proportions and spoon into a jar. Sink the jar in a shallow grave at the opportune moment and speak the incantation. Leave it for a month at least." That's what I did. The resulting essence is what I dripped into your wine. Kath looked sick. She hiccuped and sprayed blood across the table. You were the culmination. Generations of effort. A human vessel suitable for the return of the Great One. Our company has striven for centuries. A breeding program that produced you. A being with not so much as an ounce of enchantment in their bones. We despaired, I'll admit, until you spat the boy from between your legs." Kath Gould groaned, face grey, mouth leaking maroon striated saliva. "We hadn't gotten it wrong. Just simply skipped the mother and landed in the child. George is our prize. A body and mind that will welcome the return of the Lord between the walls, and herald the dawn of a new age." Her daughter slithered from the seat, lay where she fell, gripped by convulsions, trickling terrible fluids. "Does it hurt? I'm sure it must. Learn to love it in your last few seconds. That's all there is of this life, and you have eons of darkness ahead of you." Joan Demdike sighed. The cat twined her legs, and the crow hopped between the dead bodies. Such a lot to do. Tedious but nevertheless important tasks. Attending to details, tidying the scene, summoning ambulances and informing the police. George would slumber unaware, thanks to the sleeping draught she diluted into his juice. The ever-dependable Inspector Hale would conduct the investigation, and the always reliable Mr. Wentworth performed the autopsies. One a highly regarded detective, and the other an eminent medical professional, both active members of the company. All the questions would be answered and all the loose ends tied. She would raise the boy now that his parents were out of the way, prepare him, bring out the gift. And what a gift! You could see the shine in him from 20 feet. Joan Demdike had never seen the like, and she'd seen a hell of a lot. She winked at Dogum. "He's so very special. Just like you." The sun dipped below the horizon, and she lifted her arms to bring on the night. The trees murmured encouragement. Chapter 18. Everyone goes back to school. George was accompanied by his grandmother at the start of term, a thoroughly charming woman, bearing such a tragic tale. Mrs. Snady was quite shaken, thrown out of her stride. Shocking news always did that, disturbed her rhythm and turned the day into a disjointed echo of what she'd anticipated. When they shuffled out in the afternoon, she still wasn't herself. Once the routine responsibilities were done and dusted, she sat and pondered a world where good parents could fall victim to stupid accidents like food poisoning. little boys left to grow up without the love of their mothers and fathers. Still, he was one of the lucky ones in many ways. He wouldn't go into care and become an orphan of the state. Thank goodness for his grandma. She was a godsend in the circumstances. Mrs. Snady eventually turned her attention to Doggem. He'd been getting a trifle ragged round the edges before the holidays, but he seemed newly invigorated, almost glowing in the early evening light. Maybe he'd been washed. Whatever, he'd brushed up well, nearly new. She was being silly and sentimental, but she thought he looked a little sadder than before the break. Chapter 19, in my own words. George Gould was responsible for my creation. I've already said that, and am convinced the statement is true. There is a dark and sparkling potency marrowing his bones. Magic whispers through his veins and sings in the space between his cells. Some tiny sliver of that impossible alchemy jumped into me and sowed the seeds of consciousness. That it was a mere fraction of his capability is also a fact of which I am sure. It happened unintentionally when he was little more than an infant. It frightens me to ponder what heights such an ability might attain with maturity and focus. I don't know what became of him, and I'm happy to never find out. The thought causes me a fair degree of disquiet. You'll note that I'm mastering understatement. In truth, the concept of an adult George sends a quiver through my stitches. The guardianship of his grandmother. Joan Demdike was a riddle wrapped in enigma, but one thing wasn't in doubt. She was a cold and determined woman with an agenda mired in mysteries. Her priority a plan spanning generations and rooted in the dim recesses of history. The realization of that plan remains something beyond my understanding. I suspect it doesn't bode well for the majority of people on these isles. One thing I haven't mentioned. That seed of consciousness planted in my inanimate form has taken hold and is growing. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not toddling round the house at midnight when all is quiet. Not yet, anyway. Independent movement is still only a dream, not unattainable by any means. The jury's out, as they say. Yesterday I stared at a light switch for several hours. I didn't manage to flick it, but I saw the slightest tremble. Surely if I can move an object, I might one day be able to move myself. It's my mental faculties which are flowering. Quite a surprise, I can tell you. The discovery was entirely accidental, a plea from a non-existent heart somehow heard by innocent ears. Bless her. Mrs. Snady is such a receptive soul. One day, after numerous tours of duty, I gazed at that kind face, and without really thinking, sent a message. Please, don't put me in the cupboard. It's dark and boring, and a somewhat barbaric way to treat, dare I say, a valued member of the team. Someone who has contributed without complaint and delivered without fail. Her head cocked to one side, and her hand lingered on my fur. Dogum, it strikes me that you don't belong in the cupboard, away from the light and not able to see the world go by. What should we do with you? I can't deny I was surprised, slightly sceptical into the bargain. Surely it was simply a coincidence. There was no way her decision was the result of my silent request. On impulse I suggested she take me home, and was vaguely astonished when she did exactly that. In the car, the subject of my replacement came up. How it might be an opportune moment to introduce a new diary toy. After all, I'd been in service for an inordinately long time. We settled on Bigby the dog as the best qualified candidate. He was exceptionally cute. Not quite as cute as me. That's to be expected. I have some rather special attributes. There she sits now, tapping away at the keyboard despite the lateness of the hour. I mustn't tire her. She's not getting any younger. I sometimes need to remind myself not to push her too hard. Thankfully, retirement beckons. Perhaps just as well. June Snady thinks she's discovered a new passion. In writing, she's found a hitherto undreamt sense of fulfillment. That's what I've led her to believe, and she'll continue to believe it until the day she dies, or until I instruct her otherwise. She has no idea that the words are mine.